Morning, everyone, and yeah, thanks for the invitation. So my name is Dermot Lynott. I'm assistant professor at the Department of Psychology in Maynooth, a recent arrival. I'm not completely au fait with Zoom, so forgive me if I mash the keyboard or anything halfway through. Just let me know if everything goes dark. So what I'm going to talk today about is enhancing knowledge through transparency and openness. I'm going to talk a bit about the tensions between being a good researcher and being a successful academic, and how these different pressures can lead to really quite extreme problems in published literature. Then I'll talk about one method of increasing transparency, which is study pre-registration, and how that can improve the quality and rigor of our methods and the quality of the literature that's out there. And then I'll briefly talk about how local open research networks can facilitate a move towards transparency, lead to change in research culture and improvement in research quality, and talk about some of the advantages of that for individuals, universities, and society more generally. So if I can click this. So with apologies to Samuel L. Jackson and Ezekiel, the path of the righteous researcher is beset on all sides by perverse incentive structures and the tyranny of questionable research practices. So when I talk about perverse incentive structures, I mean that academics need to publish lots of papers, preferably with significant results. And if you don't have these papers, then you don't get the grants, you don't get promoted, and so on. And these incentives can be met by various questionable research practices, which operate basically at every level of the research cycle. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. But some of the divergent interests between being a good scientist and researcher and being a good academic or a successful academic. So for example, people would want a good researcher to be skeptical of the results, whereas to be successful, you need to sell your results. A good scientist or researcher interprets conclusions carefully, but to be successful, we want to highlight and exaggerate the importance of our findings. We also should consider negative results, so things that don't support our theory. Actually, that's a really good way of testing theories. Whereas if you want to be successful, actually, it's much better to ignore your negative results and publish very strategically. Ideally, you want to ignore things like social prestige, but in reality, what people who are successful often do is use, for example, journal impact factors to make their writing decisions. That actually dictates how they frame their work and where they go to publish. Ideally, we want people to challenge authority, but that's not the fastest track to success in academia. A much better route is to cite authority, make friends in high places, and that's a really good way to facilitate career progression. We know, for example, that if we want to trust something in the scientific or life sciences or social sciences literature, we should see that some effect or phenomenon should be replicable. So we would want researchers to be replicating studies to show that these phenomena are robust. But actually, that's very time consuming and resource intensive. So to be successful, only replicate really if reviewer 2 demands it of you. Try and avoid replications at all costs. As a researcher, you probably know that if you get a novel, exciting, or surprising result, it's actually less likely to be true. So you should have a much higher bar of evidence. You should be double checking these results. Replications can help with that. But to be successful, actually, it's much better if you just publish the novel finding immediately before someone scoops you, gets in ahead of you, and worry about letting someone else do the replication down the line. So we put researchers under a lot of pressure to get great results, but actually the results should be what are outside of our control. We actually want people to do great research, and then the results, whether they're successful or negative, should be informative regardless. But ultimately, these pressures lead to a lack of transparency, which reduces the quality of any given literature and the level of trust, therefore, that we can have in the findings that are out there. So look at this in a bit more detail. So this is a kind of a standard research cycle where we generate hypotheses or research questions, design or study, collect data, analyze, test, interpret data, publish, or conduct another experiment, for example. But at every level, a lack of transparency basically causes problems. We get things like lack of replication, low statistical power. Fine, they're not really to do with transparency, but big problems around selective reporting, changing hypotheses, publication bias, and lack of data sharing. So these are all little devils that are on all sides of the research process, and we need some angels to counteract these devils. So how serious are these problems? Well, just very briefly, there's a real shortage of replications in the life sciences, medical sciences, all across social sciences. About 1 in 1,000 papers are replications. It's not enough. Many studies have low statistical power. I'm not going to talk about those really because they're not about transparency specifically, but selective reporting is a real problem. So this is, for example, imagine you run a study testing drug dosage, and your theory predicts that a higher drug dosage will lead to better health outcomes. And so you run a study with a control group, a low dose and a high dose of the drug. And when the results come out, you find actually the high and low dose both do improve health outcomes, but there's no difference between the high dose and low dose. This isn't good for your theory. So what do you do? Instead of publishing those details with the slightly messy results that don't fit your theory, you throw out the low dose condition, pretend it never happened. You publish a paper that has your control and a drug condition, which is the high dose condition, and show a big effect of the drug. You're very happy, the drug company is very happy, they can sell lots of drugs and so on. So that's selective reporting, and it's rife. Basically, this kind of various forms of selective reporting have a prevalence of between 50 and 100%, depending on where you look. So that's a huge problem. Changing a hypothesis. So this is like where you might predict that, say, people in group A will perform better on a task than group B. You run a study, you find actually the reverse is true. So what really you should do is say, well, our theory wasn't supported. We need to reinterpret, rework the theory in some way to explain what's going on. What actually happens is that people see the results, change the hypothesis to pretend this is what we predicted all along, and then tie themselves in knots to make sure the theory and the data actually fit. So this is known as hypothesizing after the results are known, or harking. Highly prevalent as well. And the issue is you don't know, because we don't have the transparency of what people were doing from the outset. We can't tell that they're doing this hypothesis changing or selective reporting. Then we have two big problematic areas in terms of sharing data and publication bias. So most research papers that involve some data collection don't share their data, which is not great. It means people can't do things like double check results, rerun different analyses, check for robustness, and so on, or make use of them in other studies down the line. Publication bias is possibly one of the biggest issues to confront researchers. So there was a study by Finelli back in 2010, and he found there were about 92% of published results were positive. Basically, this just isn't plausible. The reason there's so many positive results in the literature in any discipline that you care to look at is because people are failing to publish negative results. So that means you get a completely skewed picture of what's going on in any given discipline. And so you think, wow, look at all these significant and positive results. This must be a really strong intervention effect phenomenon, whatever. But actually what you're not seeing is all the negative results. So what happens when you try and do a kind of a systematic replication of findings in the literature? How bad is it? So there's been, psychology has kind of been at the forefront in several of looking at several of these issues, mainly because psychology was still is in quite a bad way. But there have been kind of systematic attempts to replicate classic findings in various parts of the literature. So some examples in social psychology, for example, there was a special issue looking at classic social psychology findings. The failure rate, so this is studies basically running the same study again of a classic finding and not coming up with the same result or the same direction result. The failure rate was about 70%. So I think you would want to have faith in a literature, to have trust in it, you would want a much lower failure rate or a much higher success rate. I would expect something like 80 to 90% maybe would be good. So a failure rate of 10 to 20%, still pretty bad, but 70% in social psychology. In another huge project known as the Reproducibility Project, where they took 100 studies from the top psychology empirical journals and tried to replicate them as closely as possible, the failure rate was 60%. quite bad. Now, you might think, okay, this is psychology, that's barely even a science, but actually, regardless of the discipline you look at, where they've attempted this kind of systematic comparison of what the results should be when they, or should they replicate, in cancer cell biology, which I think we could agree is hard science, failure to replicate was about 90%. In cardiovascular health, failure rate 75%. These are just ridiculously high failure rates. If you told members of the public that the published literature is going to have a worse than chance level of replicating these studies, I think that they'd be really shocked. When you ask scientists, is there a crisis in terms of reproducibility of results, about 90% say yes, indeed there is. And a huge amount of these problems are a lack of transparency is contributing to the problem. So there's a lack of transparency in people's data, in the materials, how they collected the data, how they analyzed the data. Publication bias, of course, we're not getting a full picture because people are only publishing positive results. We don't see all the negative results. Undisclosed flexibility. So by this, I mean researchers, once they collect data, they effectively have an infinite number of ways that they can slice and dice the data to find exactly what they want. So there's no constraints on how they analyze data or present their results. And then lastly, incomplete methods. So often this can be driven by, space restrictions in journals. People just don't have the word count to put in all the details. That's less of an issue these days with online supplementary materials, but often it can be people being deliberately obfuscating results so that other independent researchers can't actually go and replicate their findings, but the end result is the same, that we have incomplete information out there. So I'm just going to talk about one example that would increase transparency and help us get a better picture of what's going on in any given discipline, really. So I had to think about something that would be, not focused just on psychology and wasn't too esoteric. So hopefully the examples I have will make sense. So pre-registering a study is basically specifying your research plan in advance of your study before you collect the data and you submit it to some online registry where it gets a timestamp to show that this was our study plan, our analysis plan, the methods we were going to use, and so on. And it's there before you collect the data. So what's in a pre-registration document, all it's doing is making transparent what your plans are. There's nothing in that document that you wouldn't need to run your study anyway. So it's just a means of you setting it down in advance and posting it on some repository. On most repositories, you can keep it private, and what people often do is create it and then release it once they publish their results. So they're not there's no risk of them being scooped or whatever by another group. So I'll give a couple of examples of what happens when people have to pre-register their studies. What difference does it make to the view or the overview we have of a phenomenon or an effect? So you don't need to see all the details of this graph, but this is a bunch of clinical trials that looked at the efficacy of antidepressants, all right? And the white blocks just indicate positive results from the clinical trials, and the black boxes underneath indicate negative or not positive results. And you can see there's mostly positive results, just a couple of negative results. So I'm just going to zoom in kind of on one. It's called paroxetine. I've never heard of it before, but it's just to make use of it as an example because it clearly has the most positive evidence in support of it. So if you were a patient and you were being prescribed antidepressants and your doctor showed you the evidence for paroxetine, you'd be pretty happy, I think. You'd think that looks like a good solution for me. However, the FDA, the Federal Drug Authority in the US, at one point, I'm not sure when they started, but they made sure that people were pre-registering their clinical trials for antidepressants for all drugs, in fact. So what some researchers did was go back and look at the clinical trial register and look at those studies of antidepressants, but ones that weren't necessarily published, so never made it into the published literature. And what they find is, so when they look at the same antidepressants, you get a totally different picture. So now we see paroxetine in the middle. Well, the first thing you see when you look at the graph as a whole is a whole bunch of black boxes. So a whole bunch of negative results that were not evident before in the published literature. If you look at paroxetine specifically, now we see actually there is more negative evidence against this than positive evidence. So maybe there were 8 positive trials before, and then there were 9 or 10 negative trials. Now, if your doctor showed you this and said, I'm going to give you paroxetine, I think you'd be less positive about the impact it was going to have on your life. And it was only by having this increased transparency, by having the pre-registered documents filed on a repository, that these researchers could go and see what's going on. So the right-hand side picture gives you a much more unbiased view of what's going on with these drugs. And I think, you know, it's quite clear that this kind of information is really important and can have an immediate impact on people's lives and, you know, doctors in terms of what they prescribe and so on. People need to know this information. It's quite a stark example. So elsewhere, we see very similar things. So this is also with clinical trials, just because these are well documented. And I think people appreciate that knowing whether drugs are effective or not is really important. And we've seen this a lot over the pandemic with, you know, misinformation about trials, quack solutions and so on. But with increased transparency, we've been able to get to the bottom of the evidence, or the quality of evidence, a lot of the times. So this is another example. In the year 2000, the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute required registration of all primary outcomes of clinical trials that they funded. So in this graph, you just see there's a horizontal or vertical bar in the middle, and that indicates the year 2000. So everything to the left was the clinical trials before the year 2000. Everything to the right was the clinical trials post 2000. What you see is before 2000, there were a whole bunch of trials that showed a significant reduction in risk. So this is showing the drugs are working, they're helping people. You know, it might be looking at hospitalization rates a year post administration, and they're successful. But after they had to, when they started pre-registering the trials, now there's only 9% of trials showing a significant reduction in risk. There wasn't something, drugs suddenly didn't stop working in the year 2000. What happened was researchers had to pre-register what their outcome measures were. So maybe hospitalization after a year. And now they're tied to reporting that information. And we only see that 9% of the trials show a significant reduction in risk. So what was happening before 2000? Well, often what's happening and still happens is that people are doing what's called outcome switching. So they might start out with saying hospitalization after a year or mortality after years are a key indicator of the effectiveness of these drugs. And then they find there's no effect. So then they go, okay, well, let's look at 9 months. Okay, no effect there. Let's look at 6 months, 3 months, 2 months. And effectively what they're doing there is they're rolling a dice every time they do a new analysis. And then they're only reporting when the dice comes up 6, only reporting those significant effects and ignoring all the others. So you're getting, in the pre-2000 side of the graph, you're getting a totally biased, skewed, positive picture of what's going on. And on the right, you're getting a more realistic picture of the level of efficacy of these drugs. So 9% doesn't sound great, you know, this shows, you know, that clinical trials are more often than not going to work. But actually, we're in a better position now to understand the odds of, you know, medications being useful and so on. And we were only able to see this because of the increased transparency. And it was situations like this where people could, you know, selectively report and switch outcomes and so on that led John Ioannidis, famous epidemiologist, to write in 2005 that why most published research findings are false. I think at the time, some people thought he was absolutely crazy, but basically all of the evidence so far suggests that he is right, that most published research findings are indeed false. And we need to do better. We need to increase our transparency to get a better handle on what's going on. And as Louis Brandeis suggested, sunlight may be the best disinfectant to help here. So that's just one example. Study pre-registration can really throw light and help remove bias from the picture we get from particular disciplines or sub-disciplines. And I'm just going to talk briefly about how local research networks might help improving the level of transparency in our research and how we can go about doing this. So, I mean, there are many local research networks have been set up around the world at this point, and I think the main aim for them is to consider how open research principles can be implemented effectively in their institutions, which can improve research transparency and hopefully research rigor and robustness and so on. And the idea is that you try and promote open research practices as being a form of best practice. You support those researchers who want to engage in these practices, but you also need to acknowledge these things and expect them in terms of hiring staff and promotions and so on. You can't penalize people for doing better quality research if, for example, it means they publish slightly fewer papers. And then you can organize, events, social meetings, training, and so on. And I think there's how any individual local network goes about it totally depends on the people involved and their interests, and there are just a whole host of kind of activities that you can implement to engage people and try and get people more involved in thinking about these issues. So, for example, you could have like method seminars or how-to seminars. We had one in Lancaster where I was before, a new trick seminar on various methods. Have workshops, training sessions, reading groups. You can also start to think about implementing some of these ideas in your undergraduate and postgraduate curricula. There's also increasing opportunities for people to get involved in large-scale, multinational, multi-lab projects. So often some researchers might have less resources than others, but they can contribute in many different ways to these projects. So these are like the equivalent of like the Large Hadron Collider project for physicists, but now you can get involved with them for social scientists and psychologists and other projects. Other kind of activities, I think, working with libraries is absolutely fantastic. The libraries are, keen on things like open access publication, teaching people how to curate data better and so on. These are guardians of our knowledge, so they're really keen on helping academics do this as well. And they also know about supporting researchers by hosting events and contributing their expertise. So things like Research Week or data conversations about open data and so on. Universities can help by, funding studentships, looking at meta-science or reproducibility, do things like hackathons, newsletters, have special interest groups like focusing on statistical programming or whatever it is that you're interested in. So in Lancaster, where I was before, we set up a group called Prosper. It was promoting open science practices. Someone was very proud when they came up with that name. And it started in 2017. And we tried to quantify what the impact of having the open science group was having on the research practices in the department. So we estimated that in 2015, before the start of the open science group, so from looking at journal papers that people have published in the department, that the interest in various open research activities was quite low. So we put it at about 10% for study pre-registration, open data, open materials, and we didn't know to what extent people wanted to engage and learn more about open research. So that was in 2015. In 2018, about a year afterwards, we ran a survey to see what the level of engagement was, and it had shot up. Basically, we had a majority of staff and PhD students pre-registering study and a decent number sharing data materials. And it was really great to see so many people interested in getting more engaged. And we tracked this year on year to 2020. And now we have extremely positive numbers of people being much more transparent about their research process and the outputs from their research. And the Lancaster Open Science Group that became part of a national group called the UK Reproducibility Network, which is now an umbrella peer-led organization that's really, I think, having an impact on how people are doing research and how they can support people who want to do better research. And they've recently received significant funding from Wellcome Trust and Research England to help do that. And we don't yet have something like that in Ireland. We have some movements going on, but nothing exactly the same that's peer-led. from researchers. So I'll briefly just talk about some of the benefits that we might consider from people engaging in open research, and why universities really need to support researchers engaging in these practices. So Maynooth, for example, has a 2018-2022 strategic document, and in there they have an open research agenda, which is great. So supporting a local open research group would really help fulfill these goals. Universities also benefit by reputational enhancement. So when other external partners and stakeholders see that they care about research integrity and openness, I think that benefits the university. Also develops capacity for access to funding specifically targeted at open research activities, such as those available by big funders like Wellcome Trust, and also contributes to our national framework on transition to an open research environment, which I didn't realize existed until about 2 weeks ago. But there are people who do care about these before we implement something that looks like a fully open research environment. Individual researchers might be looking at this and thinking, this sounds like an awful lot of work. And I think at times, there can be extra work involved, but ultimately there can be major payoffs. You're improving the rigor and credibility of your research. There are also advantages to you as a researcher. You get, for example, citation advantage for open access publication. When you share your data, your work is traveling further, can have a wider impact. You're also going to pick up more citations that way. You can also be addressing mandates from funders like the ERC and Wellcome Trust as well, which are demanding much more openness from researchers. So you can be getting ahead of the game there. And actually, in some cases, by embracing openness and transparency, you can be saving time in the long run, such as, I didn't talk about today, but by doing pre-registration on steroids, which is registered report publications, whereby you can get in principle acceptance of your journal articles before you've even collected the data. So this can save you, shopping your journal article around to multiple outlets, being rejected, which can take years. The time lag going via registered reports appears to be potentially significantly shorter for researchers. And of course, there are wider societal impacts as well. By being more open and transparent, you're democratizing data. This can be especially useful in developing nations that have less access to resources, but where the data you collect may actually be really important and useful in answering research questions they have or policy decisions they have to make. It also means that we increase the value from our research funding. Given that the majority of research is funded by taxpayers, then you're going to make governments and taxpayers much happier that we're getting extra bang for our buck. And of course, hopefully, by being more transparent, you increase the quality and trust people have in the research outcomes. We've seen again throughout the pandemic that in certain areas we have a real problem with trust, things like vaccine skepticism and so on, still having massive impact right now with, the majority of people in ICU are those people who are unvaccinated, for example. So if we can increase trust in our research, that can help stem some of these problems. And of course, the EU as an entity is moving towards an open science view of things, and it can help meet our national objectives as well. So, when should we start engaging in all of this? Well, as an old saying goes, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So I think even if you haven't engaged with open research practices thus far, it's not too late. And the sooner you do, the quicker you can reap the benefits, and that others can reap the benefits as well. So I think there are good reasons to do this, and equally selfish reasons to do this, but either way it can be beneficial to people. So I think I'll wrap it up there and just say thank you to everyone for listening, and yeah, if you're interested in open science at all, please do get in touch, and I'll stop there.